Have you ever felt as if something inside you was silent, but at the same time screaming for an answer? As if there were a forgotten promise, a feeling that your life could be different, lighter, clearer, but for some invisible reason everything seems stuck, distant, almost unattainable. Maybe you've tried to understand, you've searched for words, for advice, for memories, but deep down, there is a question that is not silent. Why does it seem that something essential is still missing? And this feeling does not come from outside. It grows in the quietest moments, when the day ends, when distractions cease, and you find yourself alone with your own thoughts. It is there that time seems to slow down, that doubts repeat themselves like an echo, that the heart weighs for no apparent reason. A subtle but persistent restlessness, as if your soul knows something your mind has not yet been able to reach. And the more you try to ignore it, the more that emptiness reorganizes itself within you, asking to be filled with something you can't name yet. But what if I told you that there is something hidden in plain sight, something that has always been present, but that few have really noticed? It's not a complicated formula, it's not something distant or impossible, but it's also not obvious to those who just look at it. There is a silent, ancient, spiritual key that has passed through generations and remains intact, waiting to be understood in the right way. And this key explains a lot. It explains why some people find peace even in chaos. It explains why others manage to stand firm while everything around them crumbles. There is a way, there is an answer. But it's not common, it's not superficial, and it's definitely not something that is unintentional. The most intriguing thing is that this truth is not hidden in unreachable places. It is recorded, preserved, repeated, and yet ignored. Like a code that can only be understood when you look with the right eyes. Jesus stated at John 8:32, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But what is this truth that so many have heard, and few lived? Today you are not here by chance. There is something being revealed, not as theory but as experience. And as you keep going, something inside you will start to line up, almost imperceptibly. Because what will be shown here is not just to be heard, it is to be felt. And if you stick around to the end, there's a good chance that even today, something changes inside you. On this path that now opens before you, every word is designed to touch deep areas of your life that perhaps no one else can reach. You will notice how God works behind the scenes, even when everything seems confusing, and how each teaching of Jesus carries a key capable of bringing direction, healing, and purpose to moments that seem dead-end. As you continue, it will be as if answers begin to emerge from the inside out, awakening a faith that may have been dormant. Jeremiah 33:3 says, "Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will show unto you great and hidden things, which thou knowest not." And there's something important about that, because it's not just about listening, it's about living. If this message has already started to speak to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this simple gesture can take this word to someone who also needs to find this way. There is a kind of silence that does not mean absence. It means preparation. And maybe that's exactly where you find yourself right now. A space where answers seem distant, where everything around you slows down, and inside you there is that feeling of walking without a clear direction. But what if this scenario is not a waste of time, but an invisible alignment happening? John the Baptist arose in the desert, far from the centers, far from recognition, far from everything that the world considers important. And yet it was there that God's voice found space to manifest itself clearly. Isaiah 43 declares, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the wilderness a path for our God." The desert was not a mistake in John's story. It was the exact setting where his identity would be revealed. And that changes everything, because the desert you face today may not be a punishment, but a strategy. God removes excess noise so that you can finally hear what really matters. No distractions, no interference, no shortcuts. It is in the apparent emptiness that the right voice begins to echo. The problem is that you often interpret silence as abandonment, when in fact it is an invitation to deepen your spiritual sensitivity. Because when everything is noisy, it's easy to get lost. But when everything quiets down, any whisper becomes impossible to ignore. John did not need human approval to accomplish what he was called to do. He understood something that many have not yet understood. When God speaks, no matter the scenario, the message carries enough authority to open paths where there are none. And perhaps what is missing is not more signs, more answers, more confirmations. Perhaps what is missing is a willingness to really listen. Because God's voice does not compete with chaos, it reveals itself to those who decide to pay attention. And here's something few realize. Divine direction is almost never accompanied by visible assurances. It requires a kind of trust that does not depend on what one sees, but on what one feels in the depths of one's heart. It's like taking a step without seeing all the way, but knowing that there is something greater driving each movement. Proverbs 3:5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." This is not just advice, it's a key, because while you try to understand everything, you limit yourself. But when you decide to trust, something begins to line up quietly and powerfully. The desert ceases to be a place of doubt and becomes a place of encounter. A place where you begin to realize that you were never alone. You were just being prepared. And maybe, at this very moment, there is something inside you starting to make sense, as if a piece is finally falling into place. If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, maybe it's because today was the right day for you to hear it. Don't ignore this touch on your heart. If you felt something different while listening, write in the comments, Amen. Because sometimes a simple answer is already the first step on a new path. There is something that many people don't realize, and it may be happening to you right now without you being able to explain it. Not all the pain you feel comes from the outside. Not every weight you carry started out under the circumstances. There are wounds that do not appear, memories that have not healed, guilt that has been kept in silence. And all of this begins to accumulate within the soul, influencing thoughts, emotions, and even decisions without you realizing it right away. And it is exactly at this point that one of the most profound revelations of Jesus begins to make sense. When that paralytic was brought to him, carried by hands that believed in a miracle, everyone expected the same thing, that Jesus would look at the body and solve the visible problem. But what he did was completely different from what was expected. Before any physical movement, before any outward demonstration, Jesus looked at something that no one else could see. Mark 2:5 says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." That statement was not just a sentence, it was a key, because at that moment Jesus showed that the root of many limitations is not in the body, it is in the soul. This directly confronts the way many see their own lives, because it is easier to try to solve what is visible than to face what is hidden. Old hurts, words that hurt, mistakes that have never been forgiven, neither by others nor by yourself. All this creates a silent weight, which stops the flow of life, blocking lightness, stealing peace. And over time, this begins to manifest itself in ways that seem to have no explanation. But Jesus does not ignore these areas. He doesn't go over it. He gets straight to the point. And the most impressive thing is that he does not speak with accusation. He speaks with authority and grace at the same time. When he said, "Son," he was restoring identity. When he declared forgiveness, he was breaking invisible chains that bound this man long before his physical condition. And maybe somehow you're also carrying something like this, something that no one sees but that weighs, something you learn to hide, to live with, to ignore. But that is still there, affecting everything. And this is where this promise begins to become personal, because the same voice that spoke to that man still reaches today, still enters places that no one else can enter, still touches areas that you may never have been able to solve on your own. Psalm 147:3 says, "Heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds." This is not symbolic, it's real. There is a healing that begins before any external change, a healing that reorganizes the interior, that brings lightness, that gives clarity back. And when this happens, everything around begins to respond differently. Maybe you don't need any more external answers right now. You may need to allow something within you to be restored first. If this word is awakening in you a deep desire to hear that voice and allow that healing, comment right now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant hears." Write it as a sincere prayer. And if you can, leave your like on this video, because that can lead that same word to someone who also needs to be reached. There is a moment in life when everything seems to follow a predictable script, where the days repeat themselves. The choices are already automated, and the routine becomes almost a silent refuge. And it is exactly in this type of scenario that something unexpected can happen. Not with noise, not with long explanations, but with a simple word that carries the weight of an entire destiny. It was like that with Matthew. He was in his usual place, doing what he always did, living the life he built based on his own decisions. Nothing indicated change, nothing suggested transformation, until Jesus passed by, and at that moment, without elaborate speech, without prior preparation, there came only a direct, simple, and at the same time, absolutely profound call. "Follow me." Matthew 9:9 records this moment with a simplicity that hides the intensity of what happened. "Follow me," and he arose and followed him. There was no negotiation, there was no postponement, there was no attempt to reconcile the old with the new. There was an immediate decision that broke with everything that was familiar. This reveals something that often goes unnoticed. God's call doesn't fit into your comfort zone. He interrupts, he confronts. It displaces you from where you are to a place that doesn't yet make complete sense. And maybe that's why so many people resist, because answering this call almost always requires leaving something behind. Not just external things, but old versions of oneself, identities built over time, securities that seemed indispensable. Matthew was a tax collector, someone viewed with suspicion, someone who carried a label. And yet, Jesus did not look at what he was at that moment, but at what he could become. This completely changes the way of understanding the purpose, because God does not call those who are ready, he calls those who are available. And it is in the process of walking that transformation happens, and maybe there's something similar happening to you right now. Not in the same visible way, not with the same words, but with that internal feeling that something needs to change, that staying as it is no longer makes sense, a silent discomfort, a restlessness that cannot be explained, but who insists on staying. And here's the point. Ignoring that call may feel more comfortable at first, but over time it turns into a difficult weight to carry. Because when God calls, he is not only inviting you to a different path, he is revealing a new identity, a new purpose, a new way of living. And the response you give to this call defines much more than a moment. Sets direction. Maybe you don't have all the answers right now. Maybe you don't even fully understand what you need to do. But one thing is for sure. The first step was never about understanding everything. It was always about deciding to move forward. And this decision, as simple as it may seem, carries the power to completely change the trajectory. If in some way you feel that this message has touched something inside you, as if it were a silent call, Write in the comments a simple but meaningful phrase. I will follow. Sometimes a decision starts like this, with a few words, but with an impact that can transform everything. There is a moment when life stops being predictable, and suddenly everything starts to move uncontrollably. Situations you didn't expect, problems that arise without warning, thoughts that race, the heart that tightens, like a storm that arrives without asking permission, and maybe you felt exactly like that, within a scenario where it seems that everything is about to get out of control. It was at this kind of moment that the disciples found themselves inside a boat, surrounded by strong winds and waves that seemed bigger than they could handle. The most curious thing is that Jesus was there, in the same boat, in the same situation. And yet, while everything seemed to crumble all around, he was silent. Mark 4:38 describes that he slept, and this, for many, is difficult to understand. Because when fear appears, the first reaction is to think that God is not seeing, that he is not acting, that perhaps he has moved away. But the presence of Jesus in that boat reveals something profound. God's silence never means absence. The disciples, overcome with despair, awoke Jesus with a fear-laden question. Master, do you not care that we perish? This question echoes to this day, in different ways, in many hearts. When life tightens, when the answers don't come, when everything seems unstable, it's as if that same doubt arises within you. But Jesus' answer didn't come with long explanations, it came with authority. Mark 4:39 says, And he awoke, and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Be still, be still. And the wind was still, and there was a great calm. In an instant, what seemed uncontrollable submitted to his voice. And this is where one of the most profound teachings of this promise lies. Peace does not come from the absence of storms, it comes from the right presence inside the boat. Because the problem was never the storm itself, but the way it revealed the level of confidence of the disciples. Fear exposes areas where faith still needs to grow, and this is not condemnation, it is direction. It is God showing where there is still room for spiritual maturation. Because trusting while everything is fine is easy, but trusting when everything seems uncertain, this transforms. And maybe today, your life is exactly at that point, not necessarily with visible wins, but with internal restlessness, silent pressures, situations that take away your peace. And yet God's presence is still there, not distant, not indifferent, but present, waiting for the moment when you will stop looking at the size of the waves and start trusting in his authority. Psalm 46:1 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. This means that even when everything seems unstable, there is a security that does not depend on circumstances. And when that truth begins to become real within you, something changes. The storm may continue for a while, but it no longer has the same power over you. If you're here so far, it's no accident. There is something being lined up within you, something that God is working on quietly, but deeply. And at the end of this path, we will enter a moment of prayer, a real moment of connection, where you can surrender what has been worrying you and receive a peace that goes beyond understanding. So stay with me, because what is yet to come can touch exactly what you need most today. There is a subtle but decisive difference between living guided by God's signs and living trapped in one's own doubts. And often this line is so thin that it goes unnoticed. Because God does not always speak in an obvious way, nor does the direction always come as clear as expected. Sometimes it comes as an impression on the heart, an insistent thought, a restlessness that does not go away. And it is exactly at this point that many get lost, trying to rationalize what can only be spiritually discerned. Gideon was living one of those moments. He didn't see himself as someone strong, let alone prepared for something big. On the contrary, He was in hiding, trying to survive in the midst of oppression. And it was in this unlikely scenario that something happened. Judges 6:12 records, "The Lord is with thee, O mighty man of valor." This statement did not match the reality that Gideon saw in himself. And this is where the conflict that also exists within many people today begins. God affirms something, but the mind questions, because when God speaks, he is not based on what you are now, but on what you can become. But to access this, it is necessary to develop discernment. And discernment is not feeling all the time, nor being absolutely sure of everything. Discernment is learning to recognize God's voice, even when it counteracts your insecurities. Gideon asked for signs. He wanted confirmation, and God, in his patience, answered. But there is something important in this. The sign was not to replace faith. It was to strengthen a faith that was still under construction. The problem begins when the search for signs becomes a cycle of constant doubt, where nothing is ever enough. Because there comes a time when God has already spoken, and continuing to ask for proof becomes a way to avoid obeying. And maybe you've been there, that feeling that something is being directed, but at the same time an internal resistance tries to delay the decision. One voice says, "Go." Another says, "Wait a little longer." And in this conflict, time passes, opportunities become confused, and peace disappears. But here's an important key. God is not the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14:33 says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but of peace." This means that even when the direction is not completely detailed, it carries a different peace. It is not the absence of fear, but it is a quiet certainty that that path makes sense, even without all the answers. Developing spiritual discernment is like training a sense that already exists within you, but that needs to be activated. The closer you get to God, the clearer the perception of his voice becomes. And little by little, what once seemed like a doubt begins to turn into direction. And maybe now, as you listen to this, something is organizing inside you, as if certain things are starting to make more sense. If this is happening, don't ignore it. Now state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write it as a sincere act. And leave your like, so that more people also find this direction that transforms lives. There is a kind of faith that only appears when all other options have failed. It is not a comfortable faith. It is not beautiful to human eyes. It is not built on perfect scenarios. It is a faith that is born at the limit, when time has passed, when pain has become routine, when the answers have not come as expected. And it was exactly in this place that this woman was. For years, she carried a condition that not only affected her body, but also her dignity, her coexistence, her hope. She had tried everything. I had already waited for everything, and nothing had changed. But something inside her didn't die. Even surrounded by limitations, rejections, and silence, there was a conviction that remained alive. And this conviction led her to do something that for many would seem too small, but which carried an enormous spiritual weight. She decided to get closer, not with force, not with recognition, not with guarantees, only with faith. Mark 5:28 reveals the thought that changed everything. "If I will only touch your garments, I will be healed." Notice this. She did not ask for attention. She did not demand a public miracle. She did not wait for conditions to be ideal. She moved. And this is the point where many stop. Because it is easy to believe when everything is favorable, but true faith manifests itself when there are no visible signs that something is going to happen. She faced the crowd. She faced fear. She faced the possibility that nothing would change. And yet he continued, because her faith was not based on what she saw, but on who she believed. And the moment she played, something happened. It wasn't just physical, it was immediate, profound, undeniable. Jesus noticed. Among so many people around, he identified a different touch, a touch full of intention, of surrender, of real faith. And then came the declaration that sealed that moment. Mark 5:34 says, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace." It wasn't just a cure, it was a complete restoration. Because her faith didn't just solve a problem, it reconnected that woman with something greater, something eternal. And perhaps what you need to understand today is that faith is not waiting to feel something before acting. Faith is acting even when you feel nothing. It is taking a step even when you do not see the full path. It's deciding to get closer even after so many frustrations. Because there is a type of response that only happens when you move. And here's something important. No matter how much time has passed, no matter how many attempts have failed, no matter how far away you've ever felt, a single movement of faith, when it is true, can completely change the direction of your story. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." This means that what you don't see yet may already be under construction. If this message is already touching your heart, understand that it is not by chance. There is something being awakened within you right now, and you can be part of something bigger. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This word reaches other people who are also in need of this touch of God. Do it now and help that message get to where it needs to go. There is a kind of waiting that tires more than the problem itself. It's not just time passing. It is the feeling that what has been promised seems increasingly distant, and maybe you've already lived it, or even are living it now. Days that become months, months that become years, and that expectation that was once strong begins to weaken little by little. Not because you have stopped believing completely, but because the delay begins to whisper doubts that did not exist before. Sarah knew this feeling well. She was given a promise that completely defied logic. God had said that she would bear a son. But time went on, and everything around seemed to contradict that word. The body no longer responded, the circumstances did not help, and reality screamed louder than the promise. And it is exactly here that many give up, not at the beginning, but in the middle of the road, when the miracle has not yet happened and hope begins to wear out. At times, Sarah even doubted. He even laughed at what seemed too impossible to be taken seriously. But even so, something bigger kept moving, even when she couldn't perceive it, because when God makes a promise, it is not limited to human time. Hebrews 10:23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful." God's faithfulness does not change with the passage of time, does not weaken with circumstances, does not adapt to human limitations. And here is a truth that transforms the way we see waiting. God's time is not delay, it is alignment. While it seems like nothing is happening, there are invisible adjustments being made. Situations being organized, details being prepared, paths being structured in a way that you couldn't build on your own. Silence does not mean that God has forgotten. It means that he is working at a level that your eyes cannot yet reach. The most challenging thing is to stand firm when everything around you invites you to give up. It is to keep believing when there are no clear signs. It is protecting the promise within the heart even when reality tries to steal that conviction. Because there is a difference between those who only hear a promise and those who decide to keep it until the end, and at the right moment, what seemed impossible began to become real. Sarah did. The promise was fulfilled, not in the time she imagined, not in the way she expected, but exactly in God's perfect timing. And this reveals something powerful. No promise from him returns void. Maybe today there is something that you have almost given up waiting for, something that seemed right at first, but over time was being left aside inside you. And this message comes as a silent reminder that if it was God who promised it, there is still a path being prepared, even if you are not seeing it right now. This video has come to you at the right time, and maybe it's not just about you. As you listened, someone came to your mind, someone who also needs hope, someone who needs prayer. Write that person's name in the comments. In doing so, you join a chain of faith, presenting that life before God. And there is something powerful when hearts connect in prayer, because together, things begin to happen. There is a profound difference between changing on the outside and being transformed on the inside. Many people try to adjust behaviors, control attitudes, improve habits, but they continue to feel that something essential has not been touched, as if the root remains the same, even when the fruits try to look different. And it is exactly here that Saulo's story begins to confront any superficial idea of change. Saul was not someone lost in the ordinary sense. He had convictions, he had direction, he had a well-defined identity. He believed he was right. And that's what makes it all the more impactful, because the problem isn't always in the lack of certainty. Sometimes it is in the wrong certainty. He persecuted, judged, acted firmly, convinced that he was fulfilling a purpose, until halfway through something happened that he could neither control nor predict. Acts 9:4-5 describes this moment directly and powerfully. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? I am Jesus whom you persecute." It was not a light invitation, it was not a suggestion, it was a meeting, a confrontation between who he thought he was and who he was really being before God. And in that instant, everything that supported his identity began to crumble. Because when someone really encounters Jesus, there is no way to continue being the same. It's not about adjusting details, but about completely rebuilding the base. Saulo fell, was unable to see, lost control of the situation. And that wasn't a punishment. It was the beginning of a transformation. Sometimes it takes what you use to guide yourself to be stopped so that you finally see differently. And the strongest thing of all is that Jesus did not look at Saul with rejection. He didn't define his future based on the mistakes of the past. On the contrary, he revealed a new way, a new identity, a new purpose. Saul became Paul. Not just a different name, but a completely repositioned life. This reveals something that needs to be understood in a profound way. No one is beyond the reach of grace. It doesn't matter what has already been done, no matter how distant it seems, no matter how much history has already been marked by wrong choices. When there is a real encounter with Jesus, he doesn't just improve life, he recreates. 2 Corinthians 5:17 declares, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new." This is not a distant metaphor. It is an available spiritual reality where the past ceases to define the future, and a new identity begins to be built from the inside out. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is something inside you being silently confronted, not with accusation, but with truth. Because God's promise was never just to change circumstances around you, but to completely transform who you are on the inside. And when that happens, everything around you starts to respond in a different way. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, there's a reason. There is something being worked on inside you, something that can completely change the way you see your own life. Stay until the end, because there is still something that God wants to speak directly to your heart, something that may make more sense than anything you have ever tried to understand so far. There is a quiet moment in life when a person realizes that they have moved further away than they imagined. It wasn't all at once, it wasn't with a single and clear decision, but little by little, in small choices, in distractions, in paths that seemed harmless at first. And when you realize it, There is already a distance, not just of a place, but of a presence. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult feelings to explain, because on the outside, everything may seem normal, but inside, there is an absence that nothing can completely fill. It was exactly this point that the prodigal son reached. He went in search of something he believed to be better, freer, more satisfying. For a while, everything seemed to make sense, as if she was finally living the way she wanted. But reality has an inevitable way of revealing itself. What once seemed like freedom began to turn into emptiness. What seemed to be gained began to show itself as a loss. And the deepest of all this was not the lack of resources. It was the lack of meaning. And it is in this place that something begins to change. Not on the outside, but inside. The parable shows that before any physical movement, there was an inner awakening, a clear awareness that he was far from where he really should be. And that's the point where the reconnection begins. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't require everything to be solved. Requires a decision. Luke 15:20 reveals this moment with a simplicity that carries immense depth. And he arose and went to his father, and while he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. Before even arriving, before explaining, before justifying, the father was already looking. This completely changes the way we understand God, because he doesn't just wait. He observes. He notices the moment when somebody decides to come back. And more than that, he runs. Not with demand, not with judgment, but with compassion. This breaks any idea that you need to fix yourself before approaching. The son did not come back perfect. He came back conscious. And that's what paved the way for everything that came after. Disconnection was never the end of the story. In fact, it is often the beginning of a deeper restoration than before, because when someone returns with understanding, with humility, with thirst, the experience becomes different. The father not only received his son back, he restored his identity. He gave back what had been lost, reaffirmed the place that never ceased to exist. And maybe there's something inside you that recognizes that truth. Not as a distant theory, but as something personal. Because the biggest barrier has never been distance. It was the decision to return. And the moment this decision happens, even if there is still a way ahead, something already begins to be restored. God is not far away as many imagine. He is attentive, watching, waiting for the instant when the heart decides to approach again. And when that moment arrives, what seemed distant begins to become present. What seemed lost begins to be rebuilt. And what seemed empty begins to be filled in a way that nothing else can replace. There is a type of moment in life that does not repeat itself in the same way. An instant when something is said, a direction is revealed, an opportunity is placed before you, and the way you respond to that completely changes the course of your story. The problem is that many times these moments do not come with clear warnings, nor with spectacular signs. They arrive simply, almost silently, and so they are easily ignored. Noah lived exactly this type of calling. In a time when everything seemed to go on normally, where people were busy with their own routines, God spoke to him directly. It wasn't a popular message. It wasn't something that made sense to human eyes. Building an ark in a setting where there was no sign of rain seemed absurd, and yet Noah chose to listen. Genesis 6:22 says, "This is what Noah did. According to all that God commanded him, he did so." This phrase carries a weight that many do not realize. Because obeying when everything makes sense is easy, but obeying when no one else understands. This requires something deeper. It requires spiritual sensitivity. It requires courage. It requires a firm decision to trust in God's voice above all others. While Noah was building, the world around him continued as if nothing was happening. People living, planning, completely ignoring what was being prepared before their eyes. And this is one of the strongest points of this story. Most did not realize the time in which they were living. Not because there were no signs, but because they didn't give it importance. And that connects directly with something that might be happening right now. How many times has a direction been set before you but been postponed? How many times has something inside you signaled that it was time to act, but you decided to wait a little longer? The point is not just listening, it is understanding that every direction from God carries a certain time to be obeyed. Urgency doesn't come from fear, it comes from awareness. Because when God speaks, He's not just informing, He's opening a window. And windows don't stay open forever. There is a time when it is possible to act with clarity, with opportunity, with alignment. After that, things change. Noah did not build the ark at the last moment. It began when God spoke. And it was this decision that made all the difference. While many ignored it, he responded. While many postponed, he moved forward. And when the time was fulfilled, what seemed exaggerated turned out to be deliverance. And perhaps there is something within you right now that is being awakened, a realization that it is no longer time to postpone certain decisions. It's not about doing everything at once, but about not ignoring what God has already clearly shown. Because small answers at the right time can avoid big losses in the future. That word didn't come to you by chance. There is something being aligned, something being revealed in a subtle but real way. If this has touched your soul in any way, as a silent reminder that it's time to trust more, write in the comments, "I trust God." Let this be a simple but true answer, marking a new position within you. There is a silent question that arises when the pain goes on longer than expected. Why is this happening to me? And this question does not come from rebellion. It often comes from tiredness, from a heart that has tried to remain firm, but that begins to feel the weight of continuing without clear answers. Because when all is well, it's easy to talk about faith. It's easy to believe that God is in control. But when the losses come, when what was stable disappears, when the pain becomes constant, faith ceases to be a theory and becomes a choice. Job knew this place in a profound way. He didn't just lose one thing, he lost everything that, to human eyes, sustained his life. Family, possessions, health, everything was being torn away layer by layer. And the hardest thing was not only the loss itself, but the silence that came after. No immediate explanation, no quick relief, just a process that seemed too long to bear. And yet something within Job remained, not perfect, not without question, but firm enough not to completely sever your connection with God. This reveals a truth that few accept. Fidelity does not mean absence of pain. It means permanence in spite of it. It is to continue, even when you do not understand. It's not letting go, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Pain is often interpreted as punishment, as if all suffering is a direct result of a mistake. But Job's story shows something different. There are processes that are not to destroy, they are to reveal a spiritual depth that can only be accessed when all that is superficial loses strength. Because while all is well, it is possible to know God by hearsay. But when everything is lost, the relationship becomes more intimate, more real, more direct. Job 42.5 expresses just this transformation. With the hearing of my ears I have heard, but now my eyes see you. This means that the pain, while difficult, opened up a level of insight that he had never had before. He didn't just know about God. He got to know it deeply. And this is what transforms pain into testimony. It's not the suffering itself, but what it produces when you decide not to walk away. Because true testimony is not born of a life without problems. It is born of a life that has remained steadfast in the midst of them. And this permanence generates spiritual authority, an authority that does not come from beautiful words, but from lived experiences. Maybe today you are facing something that doesn't make sense, something that seems too heavy. And the natural tendency is to want to get out of it as soon as possible. But what if, in the middle of this process, there is something being formed within you that could not be born otherwise? Something deeper, more solid, more true? Romans 8:28 says, "We know that all things work together for good to those who love God." This does not mean that everything is good, but that everything can be used for a greater purpose. And when this vision begins to form, pain is no longer just pain. It becomes part of something bigger. If you're here so far, there's a reason. Maybe this message is reaching exactly one area that you can't explain. But feel. Don't leave this video now, because there is still something that God wants to reveal to your heart, something that can change the way you are seeing everything you are experiencing at this moment. There is a silent illusion that makes many people believe that they can walk alone, that faith can be sustained only individually, without the need to connect with others. At first, this even seems possible. You pray, you reflect, you follow. But over time, something starts to weaken. Not because God has moved away, but because the human heart itself was not created to carry everything on its own. Isolated faith becomes vulnerable, more exposed to discouragement, more susceptible to doubts that, when not confronted, begin to grow in silence. The early church understood something that many today forget. They did not live faith as an event, but as a shared life. Acts 2:42 reveals this clearly. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and in fellowship, and in the breaking of bread, and in prayers. It wasn't just about learning, it was about living together. It wasn't just about listening, it was about sustaining each other on a path that often requires strength beyond the individual. There is something powerful when people come together for the same spiritual purpose. It's not just company, it's strengthening. Because there are days when your faith is firm, but there are others when it needs to be sustained by someone by your side. There are times when you see clearly, but there are others when you need someone to remind you of what you already know, but momentarily forgot. And this is not weakness, it is a project. God has never drawn a solitary walk. From the beginning, fellowship was an essential part of spiritual growth. Because the right connections don't just support, they also correct, align, direct. They help you avoid paths that you might not realize on your own are dangerous. In addition, there is a manifestation of God that happens in a special way in unity. Matthew 18:20 states, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." This shows that there is a level of presence that intensifies when there is spiritual agreement. When hearts align, when prayers unite, when faith becomes collective, something moves differently. Perhaps one of the reasons many people feel spiritually tired is not a lack of effort, but a lack of connection. Walking alone may seem simpler, but it becomes heavier over time. And recognizing this is not going backwards, it is moving forward wisely. And as you listen to this, maybe some people come to your mind, people who have already made a difference in your journey, or even the perception that you need to get closer to connections that build your faith. Because no one grows up alone fully. God has done things that often go unnoticed in everyday life. Details that reveal care, protection, direction, and recognizing this strengthens faith even more. If you feel that, even in the midst of difficulties, God has been good to you, write in the comments. Amen. Sometimes a simple word becomes a mark of gratitude and also a way to inspire others to see what God is already doing. There is a point in the spiritual journey when the problem is no longer the lack of response, but the excess of noise. Many voices, many opinions, many thoughts intersecting at the same time, creating a silent confusion within the mind. And in this scenario, even when God speaks, it can become difficult to notice. Because he doesn't always manifest himself in the way you expect. It doesn't always come with impact, with visible signs, or with something that immediately catches your eye. Sometimes the most important direction comes so subtly, which is only perceived by those who are willing to slow down inside. Elijah arrived exactly at this place. After living through intense moments, visible miracles, direct confrontations, he found himself exhausted, emotionally shaken, trying to understand what was still left. He knew he needed to hear from God, but perhaps he expected something great, something on the same level as the experiences he had already had. But what happened was completely different. 1 Kings 19 describes that there was a strong wind, capable of breaking stones, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, but God was not there either. Then a fire, and once again it was not there that God manifested himself. Until, in the silence that came after all this, something unexpected emerged. 1 Kings 19:12 says, "And after the fire a still small voice." It was there, not in the impact, not in the noise, but in the softness. This reveals a truth that completely changes the way we seek direction. God does not compete with noise. He reveals himself to those who learn to listen beyond him. And perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges today, because the world teaches you to run, to react quickly, to fill every space with distractions. But God's voice often demands the opposite. It requires a break. It demands attention. It requires a heart willing to perceive the details. Not every direction comes as an immediate answer. Sometimes it comes as a light impression, a calm conviction, a sense that this is the way, even without full explanations. And those who are not sensitive lose, not because God didn't speak, but because he wasn't attentive enough to recognize it. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." There is something powerful about this invitation. It's not just stopping physically, it's silencing the inside. It is to reduce the volume of worries, anxieties, external voices, so that something deeper can be perceived. And perhaps, as you listen to this, there is something that has already been spoken to your heart, but that has ended up being drowned out by the rhythm of life. Something simple, but persistent. Something that doesn't scream, but doesn't disappear either. And that's exactly how God often directs. Learning to recognize this voice changes everything, because it not only guides decisions, it brings peace along with the direction. And when you start noticing that, your walk becomes lighter, clearer, more aligned. This word is not for any time. She finds those who are ready to listen beyond the obvious. If you've made it this far, there's something being revealed in a personal way. Stay until the end, because there is still something that can touch exactly the point you most need to understand today. There is a type of fatigue that is not resolved with physical rest. You can even stop for a few hours, sleep, try to slow down, but still, something inside remains heavy. It is a wear and tear that is not only in the body, but in the soul. An accumulation of worries, of attempts, of silent battles that no one sees, but that you feel every day. And the hardest thing is not just being tired. It is not knowing how to regain strength. Many people, when they get to that point, begin to believe that they have done something wrong, that they have failed somewhere, that this exhaustion is a sign of spiritual weakness. But the truth is completely different. Tiredness is often not a sign that you are far from God. It is a sign that you have reached the limit of your own strength. And that's exactly where something new can begin. Isaiah 40:31 reveals a promise that does not depend on human ability, but on connection with God. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and shall not be weary. They will walk and will not faint. This is not just a beautiful phrase. It is a spiritual key. Because the renewal that God offers does not come from effort, it comes from dependence. The problem is that often waiting on God is misunderstood. It's not standing still, it's not giving up, it's not simply waiting for something to happen without involvement. To wait in this context is to stay connected. It is to trust even without seeing. It is to continue even when the energy seems insufficient. It is an active waiting where the heart is kept aligned even when the body and mind are tired. And it is in this environment that something begins to change. Not immediately, not as a momentary impulse, but as a force that is gradually restored from the inside out. Like someone who learns to fly above circumstances, just like the eagle who doesn't fight the storm, but uses the force of the wind to climb even higher. Maybe what is missing is not more effort, more attempts, more control. Perhaps what is missing is to release the weight of trying to solve everything on your own. Because while you insist on carrying what you were not made to bear alone, fatigue only increases. But when you surrender, when you trust, when you decide to depend, something begins to reorganize. Matthew 11:28 reinforces this invitation directly. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It is not a call to the perfect, it is a call to the weary. For those who have tried, who have already fought, who have already reached the limit, and maybe you're right in that place right now, not without faith, but without strength. Not without hope, but without energy. And it is at this point that God no longer requires of you. It delivers, because renewal doesn't start when you become stronger. It starts when you recognize that you need something beyond yourself. There is a part of the path that almost no one values, because it happens away from the eyes, away from the applause, away from any recognition. It is the place where everything seems to stand still, where promises seem distant, and where the feeling of injustice begins to emerge. And it is exactly in this scenario that many give up, thinking that they have been forgotten, that they have wasted time, or that something has gone wrong in the middle of the process. But Joseph's story reveals something that completely changes this perspective. Joseph received a dream, a glimpse of what God had prepared for his life. But what came next seemed to have no connection with that promise. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold, removed from everything he knew. And when it seemed that things could improve, injustice, imprisonment, oblivion came. Each step seemed to push him further away from what had been revealed. And here is the point that few can understand. The process was not a detour. It was the way. Nothing that happened to Joseph was wasted. Every moment, every pain, every difficult situation was building something inside him that would be essential at the right time. Because purpose doesn't start when everything goes right. It starts when you decide to stay faithful, even when nothing makes sense. During that time, Joseph could have revolted. He could have given up. He could have allowed pain to define who he would become. But he chose another path. He remained whole. He continued to trust, even without understanding. And it prepared his heart for something much bigger than he could have imagined at that moment. When the time was finally fulfilled, everything began to line up in a surprising way. The one who was rejected became necessary. The one who was forgotten came to be remembered. And the one who suffered injustice was placed in a position of authority. And then comes one of the most profound statements of this entire journey, recorded in Genesis 50:20. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. This phrase carries a powerful key, because it reveals that even when human intentions fail, God keeps working. Even when something seems negative, there is a greater intention being built behind it. And that means that what you have experienced, even what was difficult, does not have to be seen as a loss. It can be seen as preparation. Maybe today you are in a moment where things do not make sense, where it seems that it is taking too long, where the promise seems distant. But what if, in fact, you are exactly in the place where you need to be prepared? What if every detail is contributing to something that isn't yet visible? Romans 8:28 says, "All things work together for good to those who love God." Not some things, all of them. This includes that which you do not understand, that which you have not chosen, that which you wish you had avoided. Nothing is wasted in God's hands. And as you listen to this, you may begin to see your own story differently, not as a sequence of errors or delays, but as a process being conducted with precision. And just as you are being reached by this message now, there are other people who need to hear this as well. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you help this word reach those in need, becoming an instrument in God's hands to bring hope to other hearts. There is a pain that cannot be explained with simple words, an absence that changes the environment, that alters the rhythm of life, that leaves a silence that is difficult to bear. And when that pain comes, one of the deepest questions begins to arise within the heart. Where is God in all of this? Because it's easy to believe in His presence when all is well, but when loss happens, when something seems irreversible, the feeling can be completely different. Martha and Mary knew Jesus. They knew who He was. They had seen His power. They had already experienced His presence. And yet, when Lazarus died, all they could feel was pain. And perhaps the hardest thing for them was not just the loss, but the fact that Jesus didn't arrive at the time they expected. This reveals something very real. Sometimes God does not act in the time we would like, and this can generate an internal conflict that is difficult to understand. When Jesus finally arrives, the scene is not one of celebration, it is one of mourning. People crying, a charged environment, broken hearts, and then something happens that, at first glance, seems too simple, but carries immense depth. John 11:35 says, Jesus wept, the one who had the power to change everything. He cried, "This completely changes the way we see God," because it shows that He is not indifferent to human pain. He does not observe from afar, cold, distant. He approaches, He feels it, He participates, even though He knew what He was going to do next. Even though He knew that this would not be the end of the story, He chose to live that moment together with them. This reveals that God is not only present in the solution, He is present in the process. He does not ignore the pain waiting for the moment to resolve. He enters it, walks together, shares the burden. And that brings a kind of solace that goes beyond the circumstances. Because sometimes what hurts the most is not just the problem itself, but the feeling of being alone inside it. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is near to those who are broken in heart and saves those who are contrite in spirit." This means that in the most difficult moments, God does not move away. He gets even closer, even when you don't feel it, even when everything seems confusing. His presence is still there, sustaining, welcoming, strengthening in a silent way. And maybe today there is something inside you that still carries pain. Something that has not been resolved, something that still weighs, something that perhaps no one fully understands. And the natural tendency is to try to hide, to try to move on, to try not to touch that point. But this passage reveals that there is healing in encountering a God who not only has the power to transform situations, but who also cares deeply about what you feel. Because before any miracle happened, before any external change, Jesus allowed Himself to be there, present in the pain. And this shows that God's consolation does not begin when everything improves. It starts when you realize that you are not alone. There is a profound difference between walking without direction and walking being guided, even if the path still seems unfamiliar. Often, what generates anxiety is not only the desert itself, but the feeling of not knowing where to go, of not being clear about the next step. And it is exactly in this kind of scenario that the way God leads His people reveals something extraordinary. When Israel came out of Egypt, they didn't have a map. They didn't have human strategies. They didn't have the experience to face what lay ahead. All they had was a promise, and the presence of God guiding every step. Exodus 13:21 says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud, and by night in a pillar of fire, to give them light, that they might walk day and night." This was not symbolic, it was real, visible, constant direction. During the day, the cloud protected from the intense heat, bringing shade and direction at the same time. During the night, the fire illuminated the way, driving away darkness and fear. God did not only point out the final destination, He was involved in the daily process, taking care of every detail of the journey. And this reveals a truth that often goes unnoticed. God does not only guide in the big moments, He guides in the small steps. But there is something important in all this. Not everyone notices the signs, because discernment is not just seeing, is to understand. Often, what seems like a coincidence can be providence. An unexpected encounter, a door that closes, a direction that changes in a subtle way. All this can carry the hand of God, but only those who are attentive can recognize it. The problem is that the mind often tries to explain everything logically, ignoring what is spiritual, and with that, clear signs end up being discarded as chance. But when you start to develop sensitivity, something changes. You start to notice patterns, connections, directions that previously seemed invisible. Proverbs 3:6 says, "In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths." This means that God's direction is not limited to specific times, but can be recognized in each area of life. And when you start living like this, the journey stops being confusing and starts to be conducted. And even in the desert, where everything seems the same, God continues to mark the way. The cloud did not move by chance. The fire did not appear without purpose. There was a rhythm, a drive, a constant presence. And this also happens today, although in different ways. God keeps speaking, keeps directing, keeps showing the way. But it is necessary to be attentive. Maybe you're in a moment where you need direction, where decisions need to be made, where the next step isn't entirely clear yet. And that message comes as a reminder, you're not being left unanswered. God continues to leading, even when you are not yet fully aware of it. And if somehow this is starting to make sense within you, as a silent confirmation that God is taking care of every detail, write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Because declaring this is not just repeating words, it is aligning the heart with a truth that sustains the journey. There is a natural tendency to try to solve everything with logic, strategy, and self-strength. When a challenge appears, the mind begins to calculate, look for paths, analyze possibilities, and this, in many moments, seems to make sense. But there are situations in which what God asks does not fit into any human logic. And this is exactly where faith ceases to be just belief and becomes obedience. Jericho was a fortress. High walls, solid structure, impossible to be torn down with the resources that the people had. Any human strategy would point to direct confrontation, force, weapons, military planning. But God gave a completely different direction, something that at first glance seemed too simple, even too strange to work. They were to march around the city in silence for days, and at the right moment scream. Imagine what went through their minds, the doubt, the questioning, the feeling that it didn't make sense. Because divine instruction is not always accompanied by explanation. Often, it requires trust before understanding. And this is exactly what separates those who only hear from those who live the supernatural. Joshua 6:20 records the result of this process. The people cried out, and the wall fell down. But what many don't realize is that the miracle didn't start with the scream. It began in obedience. Each turn around the city, each step in silence, each day fulfilling exactly what was asked, even without understanding, was building something invisible that, at the right moment, manifested itself in a visible way. This reveals a profound truth. In the kingdom of God, victory does not depend on your strength, it depends on your obedience. Because when you try to do it your way, you limit yourself to what's possible. But when you decide to rely on God's method, even without understanding it, you access something that is beyond logic. And maybe there's something that God has already shown you, a direction, an attitude, a decision. But that has not yet been put into practice because it does not seem to make complete sense. The mind tries to find explanation, tries to adjust, tries to wait for the perfect moment. But the truth is that power is in obeying, not in understanding everything. 1 Samuel 15:22 says, "Behold, obeying is better than sacrificing." This means that God doesn't just seek effort, he seeks alignment. Because when there is obedience, there is a direct connection with what he has already prepared. And just like in Jericho, there are walls that will not fall with human force. They will not give in with natural insistence. But they can be brought down when you choose to follow exactly what God has directed, even if it seems simple, even if it seems strange, even if no one else understands. And little by little, something begins to change inside you. Resistance decreases, confidence grows, and what once seemed impossible begins to be seen in a different way. Because obedience opens doors that logic could never access. What you will hear from now on can connect exactly with what you need to do, but have not yet had the courage to take the step. There are details that make all the difference, and that many ignore without realizing it. Stay until the end, because what is yet to come may be the missing key for you to live what you are waiting for. There is a type of scenario in life that seems to have no way out. It's not just difficult. It is dry, empty, with no signs of possibility. It is when you look at an area of your life and you can no longer imagine change. You can no longer visualize restoration. And the most dangerous thing about this place is not the problem itself. That's when hope begins to fade silently. It was exactly this kind of scenario that God showed the prophet Ezekiel. A valley full of dry bones. There was no life. There was no movement. There was no hint that anything could be restored. It was the perfect portrait of the impossible. And then comes a question that runs through this scene in a profound way. Son of man, can these bones live? It wasn't just a question about those bones. It was a direct confrontation with the ability to believe beyond what the eye can see. Because it is easy to have hope when there are still signs. But when all seems lost, when time has passed, when attempts have failed, it is at this moment that hope ceases to be an emotion and becomes a decision. Ezekiel answered, "Lord God, you know it." He didn't say, he didn't deny. He recognized that it was beyond human logic. And then God releases a word that changes everything. Ezekiel 37:5 says, "Thus says the Lord God to these bones, Behold, I will bring the Spirit into you, and you shall live." Notice this. God did not ask Ezekiel to analyze the situation. He asked to declare about it. Because the transformation didn't start when the bones moved. It began when God's voice was released on that which seemed dead. This reveals a powerful truth. There are areas of your life that are still within the reach of God's voice, even if they seem completely unresolved. That which you have already considered lost, that which you have already put aside, that which you no longer expect, it can still be reached by a word that brings life. And little by little in that valley, something began to happen. The bones came together, the bodies were being formed, but something was still missing. Then God again commands the Spirit to come. And when this happens, life manifests itself completely. This shows that God's restoration is not partial, it is complete, profound, real. Perhaps today there is a valley inside you, something you no longer talk about with anyone, something that seems too distant to be restored. But this message comes as a reminder. God does not work with human limits. He does not depend on what you see. He acts on what you believe. Romans 4:17 says that God calls the things that are not as though they were. This means that even when you don't see anything, He is already declaring life. And when you align yourself with that truth, something changes within you. Hope is no longer fragile, and it becomes a force that sustains, that lifts, that rekindles what seemed to be erased. Because in the kingdom of God, the impossible is not the end of history. It is the scenario where He begins to act most evidently. There is a level of spiritual action that many people have not yet fully understood. It's not visible. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't attract attention. But it has the power to change entire scenarios. It is the kind of attitude that does not happen before people's eyes, but before God. And it is precisely in this place that intercession manifests itself not as something passive, but as an active, firm, decisive position. Moses experienced one of the strongest examples of this. The people had failed, had gone astray, had made decisions that had completely led them away from what God had established. And in view of this, there was a real, imminent, inevitable consequence to human eyes. But Moses did something that few would do. He did not move away. He did not omit himself. He did not say that each one should deal with their own choices. He put himself in the middle. He took a position that required spiritual courage. He spoke to God, not just as one who observed the situation, but as one who bore responsibility for it. He interceded. He presented arguments, cried out for mercy, recalled promises, and something impressive happened. Exodus 32:14 states, "Then the Lord repented of the evil which He said He would do to His people." This reveals a profound and at the same time challenging truth. One's prayer can impact the fate of many. Intercession is not just an act of faith. It is a silent war. It is when you decide to position yourself spiritually for situations that often do not even directly concern you, but that are placed before your heart. And maybe you've never thought of it that way, but how many things could be different if someone decided to pray for real? How many situations could be transformed if there was someone willing not only to observe, but to intercede? Because there are battles that are not won with human words, but with spiritual positioning. And intercession does not require perfection, it requires willingness. It doesn't require knowing everything, it requires sensitivity. It is noticing when something needs prayer, when someone needs spiritual covering, when a situation requires more than natural effort. It is to enter this place where few enter, and stay there until something starts moving. James 5:16 says, "The prayer of a righteous man availeth much in its effects." This means that what seems invisible may be generating real, profound, transformative effects. Even when you don't see it right away, something is going on. And perhaps as you listen to this, some situations or people are coming to your mind, not by chance, but as a sign that there is a call to intercede, to take a stand, not to ignore what has been placed before you. Because when someone decides to pray, things begin to line up in a way that cannot be explained by the natural alone. And if there is something in your heart right now, something that needs intervention, something that you feel you cannot solve on your own, write your prayer request in the comments. Put before God what you have been carrying, whether for yourself, for someone close to you, or for a specific situation. When hearts come together in faith, something powerful happens. And that connection can be the beginning of a change that you can't yet see, but has already begun to happen. There is a difference between knowing about God and walking with God. Many people accumulate information, listen to messages, read verses, but still they feel that something is far away, as if there is a deeper level that is never reached. And this feeling does not come from a lack of content, but from a lack of intimacy. Because there are things that God does not reveal in public. He reveals it in secret. Daniel understood this in a way that few did. He stood out not only for natural wisdom, but for a constant life of prayer, of searching, of real connection with God. While others lived only what was visible, Daniel cultivated something invisible that underpinned everything he did. And it was exactly this intimacy that opened doors to revelations that no one else could access. When a mystery was presented, something that no one could interpret, the difference was not in human capacity, it was in the spiritual connection. Daniel did not try to solve it alone, he sought God. And it was in this place of intimacy that the answer came. Daniel 2:22 declares, "He reveals what is deep and hidden. He knows what is in darkness, and with him dwells the light." This shows that there are levels of understanding that cannot be achieved with effort alone, are revealed. And here is something that completely transforms the spiritual journey. God does not hide to hinder, he hides to deepen. That which is most valuable is not exposed in a superficial way. There is a constant invitation to go beyond, to step off the surface and into a true relationship, where God's presence is not only felt at specific times, but becomes part of life. Daniel had spiritual discipline. Even in a contrary environment, even under pressure, he maintained his connection. He prayed, he sought, he stayed. And this built within him a sensitivity that allowed him to discern what others did not perceive, because intimacy generates perception. The closer you are, the clearer everything becomes, and perhaps what is missing is not more external responses, but more time in presence, more silence, more surrender, more willingness to be with God without haste, without distraction, without superficiality. Because it is in this place that things begin to be revealed from the inside out. Psalm 25:14 says, "The secret of the Lord is to those who fear him, and he will make known to them his covenant." This means that God shares secrets, directions, understandings with those who choose to remain close, not out of obligation, but out of desire. And when that intimacy starts to grow, something changes. Decisions become clearer, the direction more defined, peace more constant. Not because everything becomes easy, but because you start to see with different eyes that do not depend only on what is visible, but that recognize what God is revealing. And perhaps at this moment, there is a silent invitation being extended to your heart, a call to go beyond the ordinary, to seek something deeper, to experience a relationship with God that is not limited to moments, but it becomes a continuous path where each step is guided by a real and living presence. There is a moment when logic has already been exhausted. You tried, you insisted, you did everything the right way, at the right time, with effort, and yet nothing happened. It is at this point that many begin to disbelieve, not only in the circumstances, but even in the possibility of something changing. Because when the result doesn't come, the natural tendency is to conclude that it's no longer worth trying again. Peter knew this feeling well. He wasn't inexperienced. He wasn't just starting. He wasn't someone lost in what he did. He knew how to fish. It was his work, his routine, the environment he dominated. And yet, that night, everything was different. He tried, insisted, did what always worked. And he didn't catch anything. The fatigue was not only physical, it was emotional. It was the frustration of doing everything and not seeing results. And then, in the middle of this scenario, Jesus appears. Not with a long explanation, not with a detailed speech, but with a simple, almost disconcerting direction. Go back and cast the nets again. And here is the most challenging point of this story. It wasn't just the request itself. It was the moment it was made. After a whole night without results, after having already given up, after already collecting everything. Luke 5:5 records Peter's response. "But I will cast a net at your word." This phrase carries a deep spiritual weight, because in it there is a direct confrontation between experience and obedience. Peter could have said no. He had arguments, he had justifications, he had reasons not to try again. But he chose to trust, even without understanding. And this is exactly where something changes, because the miracle didn't happen when he tried it alone. It happened when he decided to obey the right voice. This reveals a truth that many ignore. Not every result depends on effort. Some depend on alignment. It's not just what you do, but when and how you do it. When Pedro cast the nets again, something out of the ordinary happened. The amount of fish was so large that the nets began to break. That which did not happen all night happened in a single moment of obedience. This shows that God's provision does not follow human logic. It responds to divine direction. And maybe there's something similar happening to you right now, an area where you've tried, you've struggled, you've had enough. And that's why he decided to stop. But what if God is asking for just one more step? Not based on what you feel, but on what he is directing. Proverbs 16:3 says, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established." This means that when you align your actions with God's direction, something begins to adjust in ways that you couldn't on your own. Obedience opens doors that effort could never open. It unlocks paths that were closed, releases provisions that seem distant, activates experiences that go beyond the natural. And it all starts with a simple decision. Trust the word, even when it doesn't make complete sense. And if you somehow feel like this message is touching exactly that area where you almost gave up, write in the comments, "God has chosen me." Because sometimes, what seems like just another attempt, it may be exactly the moment where everything starts to change. There is a type of prison that cannot be seen with the eyes, but that controls thoughts, emotions, and even behaviors. People who, on the outside, seem to follow normally, but on the inside, carry a constant weight, a feeling of being trapped in something that they cannot explain or overcome on their own. It is as if there is a silent struggle going on, an internal conflict that steals peace and distorts one's own identity. The Gadarene man lived in exactly this state. He wasn't just detached from people, he was detached from himself. His life had been taken over by forces that dominated him, that took him to places of isolation, pain, confusion. He was no longer recognized as an ordinary person, but as someone completely lost. And perhaps the scariest thing is not just the oppression, but the way she tries to redefine who the person is. But everything changes when Jesus enters the scene. There was no resistance capable of preventing that meeting. There was not enough darkness to hide that life from the approaching light. Because when Jesus arrives, he does not negotiate with what binds. He confronts. And at that moment, something that seemed impossible began to unravel. That which dominated that man had to retreat before the authority of Christ. It was not a slow process. It was not something partial. It was direct. It was definitive. Luke 8:36 says, "And those who had seen him also told them how that demon-possessed man had been saved." The word "saved" there does not speak only of a momentary relief. It speaks of complete liberation. And the most impressive thing comes later. That man who had previously lived in confusion was now at peace. The one who was isolated was now present. He who had lost his identity was now restored. Because Jesus doesn't just remove that which oppresses, he gives back what was lost. This reveals a truth that needs to be deeply understood. There is no spiritual prison that resists the authority of Jesus. It doesn't matter how long it has been, no matter the level, no matter how difficult it seems. Light always conquers darkness, always. And maybe you've never experienced something extreme like this story. But that doesn't mean there aren't areas within you that need liberation. thoughts that repeat themselves, emotions that are not resolved, patterns that seem impossible to break. All this can also be a form of imprisonment, and all of this can also be transformed. John 8:36 states, "If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." This is not symbolic. It's real. The freedom that Jesus offers is not superficial. It is not temporary. It reaches within, reorganizes the mind, restores the heart, and restores the identity that should never have been lost. And when that light comes in, everything starts to change. What once seemed confusing becomes clear. What once seemed heavy becomes light. What once seemed impossible is beginning to be transformed, because the presence of Jesus does not only visit, it remains, it restores, it rebuilds. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, something that really touches what no one else can reach within you. And this message did not get here by chance. There is something being revealed, something that can begin to transform the very thing you thought would never change. Stay until the end, because what is yet to come can touch the root of all this. There is a quiet detail that profoundly defines how one approaches God, and often this detail goes unnoticed. It's not in the beautiful words, it's not in the amount of actions, it's not in the spiritual appearance. It is in the posture of the heart, because it is possible to do everything right on the outside and still be distant on the inside. And this is exactly what Jesus reveals directly when he tells the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two men go up to pray. One of them trusts in everything he has done, in his discipline, in his conduct, in his own righteousness. He speaks. He takes a stand. He compares himself. Your prayer is not a dialogue with God. It is an affirmation about oneself. The other, however, does not look up, does not try to impress, does not present arguments. He only recognizes his condition and cries out for mercy. And then comes the statement that breaks any human expectation. Luke 18:14 says, "For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." This reveals that access to grace is not in how much you appear to have, but in how much you recognize you need. Spiritual pride is subtle. He does not present himself in an obvious way. He often hides in apparently correct attitudes. It is when one begins to trust more in oneself than in God, when dependence is replaced by self-sufficiency, when prayer ceases to be a place of surrender and becomes just an empty routine. And little by little, without realizing it, the heart moves away. Spiritual humility, on the other hand, is not about diminishing oneself in front of people. It is about standing rightly before God. It is to recognize that without Him, nothing can be sustained. It is to understand that no matter how far you have come, there will always be more to learn, more to receive, more to live in His presence. Psalm 51:17 states, "A broken and contrite heart, O God, you shall not despise." This means that God does not ignore the one who approaches with sincerity. It doesn't matter the past, it doesn't matter the failures, it doesn't matter what was left behind. When there is truth in the heart, there is access to grace. And that changes everything, because transformation doesn't start when you try to prove something. It starts when you surrender, when you stop sustaining an image and decide to open your heart in a real way. It is at this moment that something begins to flow in a different, lighter, deeper, truer way. Perhaps today there is something inside you that needs to be placed before God without filters, without justifications, without resistance. Something that doesn't need perfect words, just sincerity. Because it is in this place that grace finds space to act. And if that message has reached you, there is a purpose in it. God is working something within you, something that can transform the way you approach Him. And if you want to continue receiving words that strengthen and direct your spiritual life, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you don't miss what can still be revealed to your heart. There is a point in the journey of faith that separates those who only ask from those who truly trust. It is the moment when the answer does not come at the time, when silence seems to occupy the space where there was expectation before, and that's exactly where many stop. Not because they have stopped believing completely, but because they interpret silence as negative, as absence, as a sign that it is no longer worth insisting. The Syrophoenician woman entered this scenario with something that few carry, a faith that does not depend on immediate answers. She had an urgent request, something that couldn't wait, something that hurt. And yet, when he approached Jesus, he did not find what many would have expected. There was no immediate response. There was silence, and silence is one of the greatest tests of faith, because it doesn't show rejection clearly, but it doesn't offer confirmation either. It requires something deeper, perseverance. While many would have backed down, interpreted it as a no, she did the opposite. She continued, even when the words came in a harsh way, even when it seemed like there was no room for her. Something inside her remained steadfast, because her faith was not based on external circumstances, but on the internal conviction that Jesus was the answer. And that conviction kept her there, insisting, believing, staying. And then something happens. What seemed like a barrier turns into recognition. Matthew 15:28 declares, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you desire." Notice this. Jesus didn't just answer. He exalted her faith. A faith that has been tested, pressured, confronted, and yet he did not give up. This reveals a truth that few understand. There are answers that only come to those who remain, not because God wants to make it difficult, but because some experiences require spiritual maturity. They require a level of trust that is not shaken by the first obstacle, nor by the second, nor by silence. To persevere is not to insist for the sake of insisting. It's to keep going because you know who you're trusting. It is to remain even when there are no immediate signs. It is not allowing the absence of a momentary response to destroy the certainty that has already been planted within you. Galatians 6:9 says, "And let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not faint." There is a right time. There is a moment when that which has been sustained in faith begins to manifest. But this time demands something from you, constancy. And maybe today you are in one of those moments, a place where you've already asked, you've already searched, you've waited, and the silence still remains. But this message comes as a powerful reminder. Silence is not the end. He can be part of the process that is strengthening your faith for something greater. Because when the answer comes, it won't just be a solution. It will be the confirmation that staying was worth it. And at that moment, you will no longer be the same, because the faith that perseveres not only receives, it transforms those who carry it. There is a prison that does not make noise, has no visible bars, but keeps the heart bound for years. It is the weight of something that happened, of words that hurt, of attitudes that marked deeply. And the hardest thing is that, many times, this pain remains alive inside, even when everything around you has moved on. Time passes, but the memory remains, and along with it a feeling that seems impossible to let go. Forgiveness is one of the most challenging topics precisely for this reason, because it confronts what seems fair to human eyes. The desire to keep, to remember, to maintain a certain emotional distance as a form of protection. And in a way, that seems to make sense. After all, how to release forgiveness when the pain was real, how to let go of something that still weighs. But then, at the most extreme moment in history, Jesus reveals something that completely changes that perspective. On the cross, in the midst of pain, injustice, rejection, he declares, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke 23:34. It wasn't after everything passed. It wasn't when the situation improved. It was in the middle of the pain. This reveals that forgiveness does not depend on the behavior of the other. It depends on the decision of who carries the weight. Jesus did not wait for repentance. He did not demand prior change. He chose to release. And this choice was not weakness. It was authority. Because to forgive is not to justify the mistake. It is to free yourself from the prison that he tries to create inside you. Many people believe that by not forgiving, they are protecting themselves. But in fact, they are keeping alive a connection with what they hurt. It's like carrying something that should have been left behind, but that continues to take up space within the heart. And over time, it affects everything: thoughts, emotions, decisions. Ephesians 4:31-32 says, "But be kind to one another, merciful, forgiving one another, just as God also in Christ forgave you." This shows that forgiveness is not just a commandment, it is a path of freedom, a process that begins with a spiritual decision, even when the feeling does not yet follow. And perhaps the most important thing is to understand that forgiving does not mean automatically forgetting, nor ignoring what happened. It means choosing not to allow it to continue to control you. It's to release, deliver, release, even if gradually. And when that happens, something starts to change. The weight decreases, the mind calms down, the heart reorganizes. Not because the past has changed, but because you are no longer bound by it. And that's one of the greatest deliverances anyone can experience. Maybe there's something inside of you that still needs to be released, something you've avoided touching for too long. But this message comes as a silent invitation, not to justify what happened, but to free you from what it still causes within you. Few people will deeply understand this truth, because it requires courage to look inside and decide differently. But if you're here now, there's a purpose to it. Open your heart and stay, because what is yet to come can touch exactly that area that you need to transform. There is a type of decision that is not made based on guarantees, but on conviction. A choice that does not depend on what is visible, but on what is sustained inside. And it is exactly this type of decision that defines paths that, at first, seem uncertain, but which, over time, reveal a much greater purpose than imagined. Ruth found herself in one of these moments. Everything around pointed to the end of a cycle: loss, pain, uncertainty. She had enough reason to go back, to start over more easily, to follow a path that seemed more logical. No one would blame her for that. But in the midst of this scenario, she made a decision that completely changed her story. Ruth 1:16 records his words, "Your people are my people, your God is my God." This statement goes far beyond loyalty to a person. It reveals a spiritual positioning. Ruth decided to stay, not because she was sure of what would come, but because she recognized something that was worth more than any immediate security. And this is where fidelity starts to stand out. Because being faithful when all is well is natural, but to remain when there are no guarantees, when the path seems uncertain, when the results are not yet visible, this reveals a different level of trust. A confidence that does not depend on favorable circumstances, but on a deep conviction. Ruth had no way of predicting what would happen. She didn't know that, later on, she would find provision, direction, and a new beginning. At the time of the decision, all she had was the choice to stay. And that choice opened doors that she could never have planned on her own. This reveals a powerful truth. Faithfulness in difficult times builds paths that can only be understood later. Often, what seems small in the present becomes decisive in the future, because God observes what no one sees. He sees the silent decision, the internal positioning, the choice not to give up even when it would be easier to back down. Psalm 37:5 says, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do it." This does not mean that everything will be immediate, nor that there will be no challenges, but it does mean that there is a response being built for those who remain. Perhaps you are in a moment where things are not clear, where there are no guarantees, where the path seems undefined, and the temptation to go back, to give up, to choose the easiest can be great. But this message reveals that there is something being formed precisely in this place of decision. Because staying is not wasting time, it is to build something that cannot yet be seen. And when the right time comes, that which has been sustained in faithfulness begins to manifest itself in surprising ways. Ruth's story did not end in loss. She was driven to a purpose that surpassed anything she could have imagined at the time. And it shows that when someone decides to stand firm, even without assurances, God begins to write chapters that only He could create. There is a truth that many have not yet fully understood. Walking with God is not just about being protected. It's also about being empowered. There is an authority that is released when one chooses to live in line with Christ, an authority that comes not from human position nor from self-effort, but from a real spiritual connection. And this authority is not symbolic, it transforms realities. When Jesus sent out the disciples, he didn't just send them with a message, he sent them out with power. They were not experts, they had no status, they had no recognition at that time. But they carried something that the world could not offer. Luke 10:19 records, "Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and all the strength of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you." This is not just a promise of protection, it is a statement of authority. And here's something that completely changes the way you see your own life. You weren't called just to resist. He was called to influence. There is a difference between living, reacting to what happens, and living spiritually positioned, knowing that there is an authority available to face what tries to rise up against you. The disciples, when they returned, were impressed, not just with what they saw, but with what they experienced. They realized that what had once seemed impossible was now being transformed before them. Diseases being healed, oppressions being broken, lives being restored. And all this, not because they were strong, but because they were connected to the right source. This reveals that spiritual authority is not something you build on your own. It is something you receive by abiding in Christ. John 15:5 says, "Without me you can do nothing." This shows that authority is not separate from presence. The more aligned you are, the clearer what you carry becomes. And perhaps what is missing is not more effort, but more awareness. Awareness of who you are in God. Awareness of what has already been released about your life. Awareness that you are not helpless in the face of battles. Because when that truth settles within you, something changes. The way of thinking changes. The way of reacting changes. The way of positioning oneself changes. Ephesians 6:12 says that the fight is not against flesh and blood. This means that many of the battles you face are not only natural, they are spiritual. And to face them, human strength is not enough. It is necessary to understand the authority that has been given. And that doesn't mean arrogance. It doesn't mean acting impulsively. It means living with discernment, with firmness, with spiritual awareness, knowing when to speak, when to pray, when to take a stand, knowing that there is a power available that does not depend on circumstances, but on your connection with God. And as you listen to this, maybe something is being activated within you, a realization that your life is not ordinary, that there is a greater purpose, that you are not here just to survive, but to live fully and spiritually influentially. And if this message is bringing clarity as a confirmation of something you needed to understand, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Because recognizing this truth is the beginning of a new way of living, where you stop just reacting and starts to position himself with authority. There is an area of life that no one sees completely, but that defines everything that will be seen later. It's not in the words you say in public, nor in the attitudes that others perceive. It is in the intentions that are born within the heart. And that's exactly where the real transformation begins. Because before any external change happens, something needs to be aligned on the inside. Jesus, in teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, did not focus only on visible behavior. He went straight to the root, to the place where it all begins. Matthew 5:8 states, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." This reveals something profound. Seeing God is not just a future promise. It is not something distant. It is an experience that begins now for those who allow the heart to be purified. And here's the point that many ignore. Spiritual purity is not about perfection. It is not about never failing. It is not about maintaining a flawless appearance. It's about intention. It's about allowing God to work on the motivations, the hidden reasons, the things that no one else can see. Because it is possible to do the right thing with the wrong motivation. And this, in God's eyes, has yet to be dealt with. David understood this in a profound way. After acknowledging his faults, he didn't just ask to correct his actions. He asked for something much more essential. Psalm 51:10 says, "Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit." He knew that if the interior was transformed, the exterior would naturally be aligned. This completely changes the way we see the spiritual journey, because it's no longer about constant effort to look right, and it becomes about continuous delivery to be transformed. It is allowing God to enter the deepest areas, those that are often ignored, hidden, or even justified. And this process is not instantaneous. It happens gradually, in daily decisions, in silent choices, in moments when you decide to align your heart with what God expects. It is a journey from the inside out, where what was once automatic begins to be confronted, adjusted, transformed. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all things to be guarded, guard your heart, for out of it come the sources of life." This means that everything you experience externally originates from what is being cultivated internally. And when the heart is treated, life begins to reflect this in a natural way. Maybe what is missing is not to do more, but allow God to work more deeply, not only in actions, but in intentions, not only in what is visible, but in what is hidden, because it is in this place that true purity begins to form. And when that happens, something changes in the way you perceive God. Sensitivity increases, direction becomes clearer, presence becomes more real, not because God has changed, but because the heart is now aligned to see what has always been there. This journey is not about appearance, it's about essence. It's about allowing God to mold the invisible so that the visible is just a natural consequence of what has been transformed within you. There is something that many people receive, but few know how to sustain it. It is not because they do not recognize it at the time, but because they do not understand the spiritual value of what has been done. It is possible to experience miracles and still not access everything they could generate. And this happens because of a detail that seems simple, but that carries a deep weight: gratitude. The 10 lepers cried out together. They were in the same condition, in the same pain, in the same need. And when Jesus answered, the answer reached everyone. The healing happened. The impossible became real before them. But what happened next reveals something that goes beyond the miracle itself. Luke 17:15-16 says, "And one of them, seeing that he was healed, returned glorifying God with a loud voice, and fell at his feet." Only one returned. Only one realized that it was not enough to receive. It was necessary to recognize. And this return was not just a polite gesture, it was a spiritual positioning. While the others went about their lives with the miracle in their hands, that man decided to return to the source. He understood that there was something greater than physical healing. There was a connection being established, and this is where gratitude reveals its true strength. It is not just a response to what God has done. It activates a deeper level of relationship with Him, because ingratitude is not just forgetting to give thanks. It is to lose spiritual sensitivity. It is to live experiences with God and treat them as something common, fleeting, without depth. And over time, this limits what can be experienced, not because God stopped acting, but because the heart failed to perceive. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 states, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God." This means that gratitude doesn't just depend on good times. It is a continuous posture, a way of seeing life with different eyes. It is to recognize God not only in the evident miracle, but also in the details, in the processes, in the paths. And when this posture begins to form, something changes. Perception broadens, God's presence becomes clearer, connection deepens, because gratitude opens invisible doors. It creates an environment where the heart remains aligned, sensitive, open to what God still wants to do. The most interesting thing is that Jesus asked, "Where are the others?" This shows that He perceives not only who receives, but who returns, who recognizes, who values. And this recognition generates something different. Not just a momentary benefit, but a more complete experience. Perhaps you have experienced things that over time have been forgotten. Answers that came, deliverances that happened, moments in which God acted clearly, but which were not revisited with gratitude. And this message comes as an invitation to rekindle this awareness. Because when you start to recognize, something starts to multiply. Not necessarily in the way you expect, but in a deeper, more connected, more real way. Gratitude doesn't just celebrate what's already happened, it prepares the heart for what is yet to come. There is a type of fall that does not happen suddenly. It begins silently, almost imperceptibly, in small oversights, in moments where attention decreases, where vigilance is left aside. And the most dangerous thing about this is that at first, it seems to have no consequence. Everything continues apparently normal, until, at a certain point, the impact is revealed. This is exactly what happened in Gethsemane. Jesus knew what was coming. He knew the weight of that moment, the spiritual intensity that was being faced. And so, He gave a clear instruction to the disciples. Matthew 26:41 says, "Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation." It wasn't just advice, it was a protection. But while Jesus prayed, the disciples slept. Fatigue spoke louder, attention decreased, vigilance was replaced by rest. And at first glance, this may seem simple, even understandable, but that moment revealed something bigger. When surveillance is neglected, vulnerability increases. Peter is a clear example of this. He had conviction, he had firm words, he believed he would never fail, but he trusted himself more than the need to remain attentive. And when the moment of pressure came, he was not prepared. The fall did not begin in denial. It started in the lack of vigilance. This reveals an important truth. Many failures do not begin with visible error. They begin with invisible distraction. This is when prayer becomes less frequent, when spiritual sensitivity wanes, when attention to detail is lost. Gradually, without realizing it, the heart moves away from what kept it firm. 1 Peter 5:8 warns, "Be sober, watch, for the devil walketh about, roaring like a lion, seeking whom he may devour." This is not to generate fear, it is to generate awareness. Mindfulness is not about living in tension, but about living attentively. It is keeping the heart aligned, the mind steady, the connection with God active. And this does not happen automatically. It is a discipline, a daily choice to remain sensitive, not to ignore signs, not to settle spiritually. Because the further you move away from that surveillance, the easier it becomes to fall into patterns you never imagined repeating. But when you choose to watch, something changes. You begin to perceive before, to discern better, to avoid paths that could have consequences. Prayer is no longer just a moment and becomes a lifestyle. And this creates a protection that is not visible, but is real. Perhaps today there is no obvious problem, nothing that seems out of place. But this message is not just for times of crisis, it is for moments of preparation, because standing firm doesn't just depend on what you do when everything is hard, but on what you cultivate when everything seems normal. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can change the way you see your spiritual journey and your daily decisions. Stay tuned, because what comes next may be just the sign you needed to strengthen what is still being built within you. There is a level of confidence that cannot be proven with words, only with delivery. It is when God touches exactly what you value most, not to take away, but to reveal the place He occupies within you. And this is one of the most challenging moments of the spiritual journey, because it directly confronts the heart. Abraham lived this kind of test. After waiting so long, after receiving the promise that seemed impossible, he finally had Isaac, the child of promise, the visible fulfillment of all that God had said. And then, unexpectedly, comes a direction that seemed to contradict everything. Genesis 22:2 says, "Take now thy son, and offer it there as a burnt offering." This instruction was not about loss, it was about priority. Because God does not compete for space in the human heart. He desires to be above all, not out of necessity, but because only then can life be properly aligned. And Abraham understood something that few understand. What you don't give totally can end up occupying the place that belongs to God. The path to the mountain was not only physical, it was internal. Each step carried a decision. Every moment required trust. There were no full explanations, there were no visible guarantees. Only one certainty: God had spoken. And that was enough for Abraham to continue. And here's the deepest point of this story. God did not interrupt at the beginning. He allowed Abraham to reach the limit of surrender, because it is at this limit that the heart reveals itself completely. Not what you say, but what you are willing to do. When Abraham took a stand, when he demonstrated that God was above even the promise he received, something happened. The provision was released. Genesis 22:14 states, "On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." This reveals that God's provision is not separate from giving. It manifests itself in the place where trust is complete. Often, what seems like a loss is actually an adjustment. God didn't want to take Isaac away. He wanted to make sure Isaac didn't take his place, because when something becomes greater than God within the heart, it begins to misalign the whole life. And maybe there is something like that today. Not necessarily something visible, but something that takes up space, that holds attention, that generates emotional or spiritual dependence. And God silently begins to touch this area, not to destroy, but to reposition. Matthew 6:21 says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This means that what you value most defines the direction of your life. And when God becomes the center, everything else finds its right place. Total surrender does not generate emptiness. It generates space for something bigger. It doesn't destroy, it liberates. Because when you trust at that level, you allow God to act completely, without barriers, without limits imposed by fear or insecurity. And that's where something new begins. Not just externally, but within you. A different peace, a firmer trust, a certainty that does not depend on what you have, but on who God is. And this is the basis of a life that is not shaken, because it is totally aligned with that which is eternal. There is a moment in life when it is not the lack of opportunities that confuses. It is the excess of paths. Decisions need to be made, directions need to be chosen, and what seems right to human eyes is not always the best way. And it is exactly at this point that wisdom ceases to be something desirable and becomes essential. Solomon came to this place at the very beginning of his journey. He had before him the responsibility of leading, of deciding, of leading an entire people. And God gave him an unusual opportunity to ask for whatever he wanted. He could have chosen riches, security, immediate success. Everything seemed justifiable. But the choice he made revealed something much deeper. 1 Kings 3:9 records his request. Give your servant an understanding heart to judge. He didn't ask for resources. He asked for discernment. He didn't ask for facilities. He asked for the ability to decide correctly. This shows that Solomon understood something that many ignore. A right decision can generate results that no resource alone could produce. Divine wisdom is not just knowing what to do. It is knowing when, how, and why to do it. It is to see beyond appearance, to perceive what is not evident, to choose based on something deeper than emotion or impulse. And that makes all the difference. Because often, the problem is not in the lack of options, but in the wrong choice between them. Paths that seem good at first can lead to unexpected consequences. Decisions made without discernment can generate unnecessary burdens. And that is why wisdom becomes an invisible protection, guiding each step precisely. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. This reveals that wisdom is not born only from experience, it is born of connection with God. This is when you stop relying only on your own logic and start looking for a direction that comes from something bigger. And the most important thing is to understand that this wisdom is still available. James 1:5 states, And if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally to all. This means that you don't have to decide on your own. You don't have to carry the weight of trying to get everything right on your own. There is an accessible source ready to direct, but this wisdom requires something, sincerity, a heart willing to listen, to adjust, to consider paths that may not be the most obvious, because God's direction will not always be the easiest, but it will always be the safest. Maybe today you are facing important decisions, choices that can define next steps, paths that are not yet clear. And this message comes as a reminder. You don't have to rely only on what you see. There is a direction available, a wisdom that can align everything precisely. And when that wisdom begins to guide your decisions, something changes. Anxiety decreases, clarity increases, confidence is strengthened, because you stop walking based only on trial and error and starts to walk with direction. And this transforms not only the path, but the destiny that is being built with each choice made. There is a very fine line between what is sacred and what becomes ordinary when it is no longer treated with reverence. And the most dangerous thing about this is that this change does not happen abruptly. It happens gradually. Small concessions, small distractions, small negligences that over time transform what should be separated into something treated like anything else. When Jesus entered the temple and saw what was happening, he did not remain indifferent. That place, which should be dedicated to the presence of God, had become a space of exchange, of interest, of spiritual distraction. And his reaction was direct, firm, non-negotiable. John 2:17 states, "The zeal of your house will devour me." This wasn't just outrage, it was zeal, a deep zeal for what is holy. This reveals something that goes beyond that historical moment, because the temple was not just a physical place. He pointed to something bigger. 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God?" This means that the same principle applies to the human heart. What was once represented by a physical space now manifests itself within each person, and this is where the reflection becomes deeper. What has occupied this space? What has been allowed to remain? Because just as then, today, there is a risk of mixing what is sacred with what should not be there. Thoughts, habits, priorities, all of this begins to define the interior environment. Spiritual zeal is not about external rigidity, it's about internal care. It is recognizing that there is something valuable being held within you, something that needs to be protected, preserved, aligned. And this requires attention. It requires decisions. It often requires removing that which does not fit in with God's presence. And this removal is not always comfortable. Just as in the temple, where everything had to be confronted, so too within the heart, there are areas that need to be adjusted. Not by imposition, but by understanding. Because when you realize the value of what you carry, you start to treat it differently. Hebrews 12:28 says, "Let us serve God with pleasure, reverence, and fear." This does not speak of fear. It speaks of respect, of conscience, of recognition. It is to understand that the presence of God is not something ordinary. It is not something that can be treated in any way. And perhaps upon hearing this, some areas will begin to be revealed, not in an accusing way, but in a clear way. Places where zeal has waned, where attention has been lost, where the sacred has begun to be treated as routine. And this perception is not to generate guilt. It is to generate adjustment. Because when zeal is restored, something changes. The presence becomes more sensitive, the connection stronger, the heart more aligned. And what once seemed distant begins to become real again. At the end of this path, there is something that goes beyond words, beyond understanding, an experience that touches deeply. Stay until the end, because what's being built here can make room for something you may never have felt that way before. There's a silent difference between what you expect and what God desires to do. Often, human expectation is limited to what is immediate, to what resolves the moment, to what seems sufficient to continue. But God does not work only to meet momentary needs. He works to transform complete realities. The man at the door of the temple knew only one way to wait. Every day he was taken there. Every day he asked for alms. Every day he repeated the same cycle. His expectation was limited by his experience. He didn't expect change. I only expected maintenance, something that would help him to continue, but not necessarily to get out of that condition. And then, in a seemingly ordinary moment, something different happens. Acts 3:5-6 says, "And he looked at them, hoping to receive something. And Peter said, 'I have neither silver nor gold, but what I have I give you.'" Notice this. He expected something small, but he was about to receive something that would completely change his life. This reveals a profound truth. God often answers beyond what you ask, but it is necessary to be open to what he wants to deliver. Because when expectation is limited, perception is also limited. And the risk is to receive something big, but not recognizing the value at the moment. Peter did not deliver what the man expected, delivered what he needed. And at that moment, something supernatural happened. Strength entered the legs, movement returned. What had never been experienced became real. It was not a temporary relief. It was a complete transformation. Ephesians 3:20 states, "Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think." This shows that God is not stuck at the level of his expectation. He can go further, much further. But there is a silent condition in this, being willing to receive the unexpected, because the unexpected often breaks patterns. It doesn't follow the script you created. It doesn't happen the way you imagined. It doesn't arrive in the format you asked for. But still, it's exactly what you need to experience something new. Maybe you're expecting something specific, a definite answer, a clear solution. And that's not wrong, but this message comes to amplify something inside you. What if God wants to do it differently? What if the answer comes in a way that you didn't plan for, but that is bigger than you imagined? Isaiah 55:9 says, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways." This means that there is a level of God's action that completely surpasses human logic. And when you open yourself up to that, your faith expands as well. That man arrived expecting alms and walked away. It arrived limited, and he left transformed. And it all started with a simple expectation that was surprised by something bigger. And if you somehow feel like this word is adjusting something inside you, like God is broadening your vision to something that hasn't happened yet, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because recognizing this is the first step to living something that goes beyond what you asked for, and enter into a new dimension of what God has already prepared. What has just been revealed shows that God does not work within the limits of what you expect, but beyond them, leading your life to a level that your own eyes cannot yet fully see. And when that truth starts to touch the heart, something inside you realizes that it's no longer about going on the same way. It's about answering that call with real delivery. The promise that sustains this moment is in Jeremiah 29:13, "And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart." This reveals that God is not distant nor inaccessible, but ready to manifest himself to those who approach with sincerity, without reservations, without masks. Now, everything that has been built so far converges to this moment, not as another stage, but as an encounter. A moment where you can open your heart, surrender what weighs, align what is confusing, and trust that God is listening to every word, even those that cannot be expressed. Allow yourself to step into that place of true connection, where God's presence becomes more real than any worries around you. Beloved Father, your word declares in Lamentations 3:22-23 that your mercies are renewed every morning, and it is with that confidence that we now approach, recognizing that your presence is here, reaching each heart in a unique and profound way. Lord, we thank you for every teaching revealed, for every truth that has touched the inside, for every direction that has been released along this journey. Thank you because the Lord speaks, the Lord guides, the Lord transforms, and nothing that has been experienced so far has been by chance, but part of a greater purpose that is being established. Now, God, we ask you for the strength to live all that has been understood, wisdom to apply each principle, and faith to continue even when there are no immediate answers. Teach us to trust more, to depend more, to listen more to your voice more than any other. Give us discernment to make right decisions, courage to obey even without fully understanding, and a sensitive heart to recognize your presence in every detail of life. Lord, visit now those who are weary, bringing true rest to the soul. It touches those who are sick, releasing healing, renewal, and life. It enters homes where there is conflict and restores relationships, bringing peace where there was once tension. For those facing financial difficulties, it opens doors, brings provision, and shows paths that were not visible before. For those who are emotionally shaken, it brings solace, balance, and renewed hope. And for those who feel distant, rekindle the flame, restore connection, and reveal your love again in a living way. At this moment, each person presents before you what no one else sees: thoughts, pains, silent requests that only the Lord knows. Receive, God, every cry that is being made now, even those that cannot be expressed in words. May your presence reach into these deep areas and begin to transform from the inside out. We surrender everything into your hands, our fears, our dreams, our plans, and also what we do not yet understand. We trust that your will is perfect and that you are in control of all things. As Philippians 4:7 says, "May your peace, which passeth all understanding, guard every heart and every mind at this time, and may every step be guided by your light from now on, every decision be aligned with your will, and every life be a reflection of your grace. We declare victory, restoration, and new beginnings in the name of Jesus." Amen. This message you just heard is not just another content. It is a direct call to your heart, because God has chosen you to be here today to receive something that can completely transform the way you live. Throughout this journey, you have been led by teachings that reveal that God's promise is not distant. It is alive, present, and accessible to those who choose to respond. Each principle shown here points to a simple and profound truth. Transformation begins when you decide to act. It's not about knowing more, it's about living differently, trusting more deeply, and allowing God to lead every step. And now a question arises that cannot be ignored. What are you going to do with all that you have received today? I'm glad to know that you're here until this moment, because it shows that there's something being worked on within you. We are walking together on this journey of faith, and your presence here makes all the difference. I want to invite you sincerely. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this allows this message to reach other lives. And more than that, right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of your story, because it matters to God and also to everyone who is here, creating a chain of faith and prayer. And it doesn't end here, because there's something even deeper in the making. In the next video, you will understand how to practically apply all that has been revealed and how to live daily in the presence of God, constantly experiencing direction, peace, and purpose. This journey continues, and each step reveals something new. Something that can completely change your reality if you decide to stay. This continuity is not just watching. It is advancing spiritually. It is allowing each truth to become practical in your daily life, in your decisions, in your attitudes, in the way you see each situation. God did not reveal all of this by chance. There is a specific purpose being built in you, something that may not yet be entirely clear, but which has already begun to manifest from the inside out, strengthening your faith, aligning your thoughts, and preparing new paths before you. Stand firm. Don't back down, even when you don't understand everything, because God is guiding every detail and sustaining you in every step, leading you to something greater than you imagined today. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.